Stan, are we ready with the mic? We are. Wonderful. Okay, I have to do this because it is our scholar series, so it's time to embarrass Professor Stanley Thangaraj, who has been with us since only 2022, but is so larger than life that I just assumed you were here for like lots of time. He inaugurated the Hayden Chair for the study of race, ethnicity, and social justice. But to get to this point, I was just checking out, he has traveled extensively, at least geographically. With the intellectual one, I'll leave you to tell us about your journey. He got a bachelor's in anthropology and political science at Emory in Atlanta, Georgia. Moved on to a master's in social sciences, University of Chicago. Went on to a Ph.D. in socio-cultural anthropology at Urbana-Champaign. Then went on as an associate professorship at the City College of New York before we were fortunate enough to have Professor Thangaraj right here. Last year, he co-edited a book called Athletic Activism, which is why I was chasing him, and maybe you can just talk one sentence about that. And before that, this was also an edited collection, which we have here, the Asian American Sporting Cultures, and 2015, the beautifully titled, very intriguing Desi Hoop Dreams, which is also at the library. Pickup Basketball and the Making of Asian American Masculinity. So I was just going through it, and I'm going to check that out, Stan. And you are a basketballer yourself, correct?
I pretend to be.
Wonderful. So next year, keep a lookout for Stan's book, Writing in the Sand.
Which I'm changing the name, but that's one of the working titles.
But it's still UT Press.
Yes.
University of Texas Press.
Yes.
And today I think we have the privilege of being the first group to get a preview of this.
Second group, first large group, but it's yeah.
We're in America.
Yeah.
We're always something. So we're the first largest group. So, and I do have to give this warning, which Ed has been hearing for the last 20 years. Eastern Cable and Joe have very kindly are going to film this. So if anybody is in America's Most Wanted, now is your chance. But before further ado, Professor Stan Thangaraj.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, thank you very, very, very much for being here, folks. I know it's hard to get here in the afternoons with everything that happens in our lives, so I'm really, really grateful. So I just want to start off with just sharing what this is. It's a chapter in my book project called Placing Kurdish America, which another title is Writing in the Sand. And this is a larger book project that looks at Kurdish America and the practices of placemaking, meaning how do stateless communities create Kurdish places? And I'm not interested in the practices of belonging because I see that as not possible for stateless communities in the nation state. Rather, I'm interested in how gardens become sites to stress insistence and the long history of Kurdish culture, to say we are here. Gardens as an emblem of presence. So let me thank several people who were crucial to this chapter. The first group that read it was Samira Akella, Guille Caballero, and Ash Keeney, who are three of the new faculty hires for the cluster hire for the Center in Poli-Sci English and Sociology. I'm so grateful for their insights. All the great points in this paper are through their thoughts and their time, and the errors are solely mine. And I'm grateful to all the Kurdish Americans who let me into their homes, gardens, farms, and vineyard from 2011 till 2024. So, as we know, every anthropological project starts with a story. So let me begin with a story from my trip in 2022 to the Kurdish vineyard called MS Torin Winery. I had never been to Napa Valley or Sonoma previously. Wine wasn't my thing. I was thrilled to drive through such beautiful green valleys and mountains in July 2023. Once I got through the heart of Napa Valley, all of a sudden, the vineyards disappeared. I made a turn onto Bragg Street and drove a mile before I came to the incredible gate with M.S. Torin Winery scribbled metallically on the wooden blocks. I opened the heavy gate and I made my way up the very steep driveway, and Sid Torin, the owner, had written, "Welcome to Little Kurdistan," on the rock wall. As I drove slightly more up this nearly mile-long driveway with a steep grade on the hill to the right of the driveway, there stood the colors of the Kurdish flag, reflected through orange stones, white stones, green stones, and yellow stones that Torin had secured from the nearby lake Berryessa. At the midway point of this driveway on a stone wall stood the phrases, "Welcome," and "Han biz her hatine" in English and Kurmanchi, a Kurdish language. At the top of the driveway was the guest house, pictured below with the Kurdish laundry and the outdoor amphitheater nicknamed Mesopotamia beneath it. Kurdish histories and Kurdish plays come to life in the M.S. Torin Winery. Torin was committed to making space and practicing insistence, the continued living and life-making of Kurdish people and Kurdish culture. A Kurdish place cultivated through the vineyard, and through it, Sid Torin had said that this was a place that to him felt like home. So before I get into the longer story of Kurdish life, I want to quickly engage with where Kurds come from. And in this project, I'm really committed to understanding the role of gardens as a form of kinship making. How do Kurds create a sense of relationship and family to both the land and to all things on the land through their gardens? So before I begin, let me just share with you a little bit of the social context. So what you see is Kurdistan, and Kurdistan is an area that is not legible in our political maps because it's been swallowed by when the nation states were formed of Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Turkey. And so the Kurds I am talking about in my project come from different Kurdish, different migration patterns from across all four sectors of Kurdistan. So the earliest community of Kurds came from this area, which Kurds label as Bakur, which is a Kurdish term for North Kurdistan. And they came in the late 1800s and early 1900s to work in the Kurdish to work in the coal mines and the copper mines and at Ford Industry as copper and coal were booming in the late 1800s and early 1900s. You needed exploitable labor, and the presence of Christian American missionaries opened the way for the movement of Kurds to work. But for my garden project, most of the Kurds came from the late 70s on. So the first group of Kurds that I got to know came in 1977 from Iraq, the area known as Bashur, meaning South Kurdistan. And they came after the failure of the Kurdish rebellion in 1975 and the attack of the Ba'ath Party and Saddam Hussein. They fled to Iranian refugee camps before eventually coming to Nashville. About 50 to 60 Kurds from affluent families, Kurdish families, and who were highly educated, went to college back in Iraq, came on those early waves. Then in 1986, another group of Iraqi Kurds, nearly 7,000, came to to Nashville. These were Kurds who were on the verge of experiencing Saddam Hussein's Al-Anfal campaign, which was the spoils of war, where it was an attack on all non-Sunni Muslim Arabs. So Kurds and Shia Muslims were attacked, and the chemical warfare that ensued, especially at Halabja, where it killed thousands and thousands of Kurds. The 1986 Kurds, who were mostly rural farmers and construction workers, left and fled to refugee camps in Ahmed and in Mardin, where as sites of anti-Kurdish policy, they knew there was no life in the refugee camps there. So they came to the US, were spread all throughout the US, but they heard about the little Kurdish community in Nashville and said, we're going to move there. And they said the hills of Nashville looked like the mountains of Kurdistan. So they made that move. And in 1996, Kurds came. These were the Kurds who were helping US military and US personnel in the US war in Iraq. So these were folks who had ties to the US, and now with the US leaving, they felt threatened, and so they got special immigrant visas, which are reserved for personnel that work for the US government, and several came as asylum workers. And these Kurds were highly educated and spoke English fluently because they were already connected to the US government, okay? And then in 1992, a small group of couple of hundred Kurds from Iran, which is known as Rojalat, meaning Eastern Kurdistan, left with the increasing attacks by the Iranian government on non-Persian and non-Shia Muslim communities, specifically targeting Kurds. And they left to refugee camps in Iraq, and from Iraq they came to the US and heard about the growing Kurdish community in Nashville and made a straight beeline to that community. And then I studied Kurds in the northeastern US, and those Kurds came from the 1970s onwards, and unlike the refugee Kurds from Iraq and Iran, most of them came on student visas and business visas. So these were highly educated, very much tied to civil society, and were coming from Bakur, Turkey, northern Kurdistan, and as well as from Rojava, which is western Kurdistan in Syria. So it's so vital that we talk about what gardens do here by talking about the experience and connections to land back in Kurdistan. The histories of dispossession, settler colonialism, displacement, and ongoing colonialism inform Kurdish-American relations to gardens, farms, and land in the US. They were escaping situations where it was hard to plant roots, both botanically and symbolically. Kurds in Kurdistan have experienced ecological disasters through the advancements in science, technology, and capitalistic accumulation, punctuated by state violence, extraction, and toxic leftovers. With the connections between wealth, profit-making capitalism, and the nation-state, Turkey, Syria, Iran, and Iraq sought to control natural resources for profit-making through the removal of Kurdish people and the extraction of Kurdish lands. Turkish and Iranian strategic de-development of Kurdish regions have led to Kurdish people leaving the region to find life elsewhere. There were few economic opportunities for Kurds on their ancestral lands. With the implementation of dams in Rojalat, quote, 1 million hectares of agricultural land, orchards and forests, end quote, have been submerged, whereby damaging the local ecosystem for the benefit of the Persian majority cities in the center of Iran. Likewise, the institution of dams in the Kurdish region of Turkey, Bakur, has disrupted the natural movement of water and negatively impacted Kurdish areas. Kaylee notes, quote, varieties of watermelon, melon, peach, and cucumber unique to Ahmed, which is also known as Diyarbakir, named after their terrier, sand peach, gravel, watermelon, etc., and grown across these floodplains became uncultivatable. Similarly, the Raphatus soft-shelled turtles, historically found in great numbers along the Tigris, are now rated as quote-unquote endangered by the International Union for Conservation of Nature. The sand that once characterized the Tigris's floodplains and is integral to the livelihood of this animal is now largely gone. end quote. And also with mountains as sites of shelter and food for Kurdish communities, Turkish military set forests on fire to counter Kurdish insurgency. Environmental destruction and environmental racism were military strategies used by Turkey. Accordingly, Turkey destroyed the relationship that Kurds had established with the soil, the air, the water. And in late 1990s, Iraqi despot Saddam Hussein unleashed a vicious chemical warfare campaign, especially in Halabja, upon Kurds and Shia Muslim Arabs. The chemical warfare spread toxicity across human bodies and the natural landscape. Kurdish land was destroyed and poisoned. In addition to the Iraqi government's warfare against Kurds, the civil war between two Kurdish parties in Iraq negatively impacted Kurdish agriculture. The deforestation, loss of biodiversity, and the erosion of ecosystems made Kurdish life precarious. And with the destruction of local food sources, stateless communities, such as the Kurds, had to depend on the occupying nation state for their daily life. Kak Kamal, and Kak is a Kurdish word of respect for an elder. Kak Kamal, who came post-1977, specifically mentioned how their garden, with all the trauma they had endured in Iraq and in the refugee camps, offered salvation. Gardens for Dilva, a child of post-1986 Kurds, are important because, quote, nature's resiliency and perseverance that is tied to my people, meaning the Kurdish people, and all people, end quote. Importantly, being in the garden, farm, or vineyard transported an enjoyable, desirable Kurdistan to the U.S. context. Shanar, a child of post-1986 Iraqi Kurdish refugees, explained, quote, looking at the garden, it reminds me of home. It is relaxing. If I have a minute, I'm in the garden, end quote. Kak Rabin, a post-1986 elder, emphasized, quote, when I get something from my garden, I feel like I am home. I feel good, end quote. And he added, quote, it is your second house. It makes me happy and keeps my mind busy, and concluded, a garden is a part of our lives. And Kosh Iram, the word for a woman Kurdish elder, who came post-1986, said, the garden gives her a great sense of autonomy, freedom, and independence. She iterated, quote, this is our own, end quote. And that comes with a sense of freedom. As refugees often had to rely on so many people and institutions, the garden gives her the freedom not to rely on other people. And now I want to talk about the ways in which the built environment and the natural environment of the garden is made into a Kurdish place. Sid Torin used Kurdish language to materialize Little Kurdistan in Napa Valley. When he took me on his kubota to the very top of the vineyard, the view was breathtaking, and that's the view. On the beige-brown shades of the mountaintop with patches of green, I could see Oprah Winfrey's massive vineyard on one side and the beautiful blue radiant waters of Lake Berryessa glistening in the sun on the other side. Sid used Kurdish language to make this beautiful landscape into Little Kurdistan. When he took me on his kubota to the very top, among this breathtaking view, on the beige-brown shades of the mountaintop, he had created a Kurdish compass, a circular stone wall he had built that represented the four cardinal directions that embodied the portions of Kurdistan embedded in Turkey, Bakur, Syria, Rojava, Iran, Rojalat, and Iraq, Bashur. These were the Kurdish terms for the cardinal directions. He assembled the Kurdish compass with his own hands. Below is the photo of the direction of South Kurdistan, articulated through Basur. From this peak, on the top of the vineyard, 4 roads, each signifying the 4 corners of Kurdistan, ran from the top of the vineyard to the rest of the vineyard. This compass reimagines U.S. empire by inserting Kurdish geographies upon a landscape dominated by English and Western geographies. The indigenous geographies refused in the Middle East region were now reinserted on Native American land that required the displacement of indigenous communities. The Kurdish compass on top of the mountain is a form of orientation that inserts Kurdishness into a white Anglo-Saxon environment removed of indigenous communities. As refugees and immigrants, they are part of the settler colonial project. There were no connections with Native Americans to co-create worlds in a material, collaborative, and corporal sense, but this Kurdish placemaking was a way to make it a Kurdish place. So names mattered, and naming and Kurdish placemaking also took place with the water pipes in his vineyard. Water is deeply embedded with Kurdish lives and Kurdish stories. Everybody told me about a river or a creek they knew back home. As water flowed through many areas of Kurdistan and were vital to the agricultural richness of the region, water was an important aspect of Kurdish and Kurdish diasporic life. Having assembled and laid down the pipe for the entire 40-acre vineyard by hand, Sid Torin listed the water schedule on the side of the guest house. And you can see the list, the intentional spelling of Kurdish cities and Kurdish towns on the area irrigation day orders. So those town names are not always present in these countries because they've been replaced by Turkish, Arabic, and Persian town names. Turkey, Iran, Syria, and Iraq have intentionally erased and in some cases forbidden Kurdish names for places and people. With such delight and conviction, Torin inverted the state's practice of symbolic violence. The entire vineyard, each section, each little part of the vineyard and their watering schedules were organized by Kurdish villages, towns, and cities. The names and language served as a form of continued presence and pleasure while creating a unified Kurdistan that did not exist actually back home. And another part of the establishment of collective memory and countering the nation's control of media and public discourse was the establishment of sheroes and martyrs across the vineyard. While the nation creates its own desirable history through practices of hero making and the exclusion of various people, Sid offered an alternate, painful, and desired archive on the land. Across his tour of the vineyard, for me and other guests, what you encounter is an archival experience. On posts spread out across the vineyard, Torin lists names of Kurds and non-Kurdish allies who were killed across parts of Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Syria. The names included important Kurdish and non-Kurdish figures across sciences, politics, and entertainment. The names traverse modern Kurdish history to the contemporary moment. For example, on one of the stones, Torin painted the name Sheikh Sayed. Sayed played a vital role in the earliest of Kurdish revolutions that were faced with state violence in Turkey in the early 1900s. With a focus on Kurds and allies across all four corners of Kurdistan, Torin recently put in the name of Gina Masha Amini, who some of you know as the young woman killed by the morality police in Iran in 2022. Amini was killed by the Iranian morality police, and her death sparked feminist protests while there was still a silence on her Kurdishness and the anti-Kurdish racism in Iran. And thus you see Gina, which was not part of her state name, mentioned that as her family name in the Kurdish flag colors. These stones and posts constitute important seeds of Kurdish history and Kurdish agency. These archival markers, just like the relationships to the land, are dynamic and meaningful based on time. For example, when a portion of his vineyard burned down because of the wildfires in 2020, Sid Torin moved the Halabja sign to the area most impacted by the wildfire. The new place for the Halabja sign puts in conversation the wildfire with the chemical warfare during the Al-Anfal campaign initiated by Hussein that was unleashed upon Kurds, especially in Halabja. Here we see the power of Kurdish signposting in materializing the histories of Kurds while connecting the present time and space. This is a moral engagement with the landscape for all visitors. This moral engagement and history are curated carefully and powerfully by Sid Torin. So with that, we then have to think about how, upon this intentional, meaningful landscape, do we then start thinking about the relationships to plants and animals. So to use the land in a responsible way, most Kurdish Americans first attended to the soil. They practiced their own forms of reciprocity by caring for the soil. While chemicals are a dominant part of modern day agriculture and gardening, the Kurdish Americans I got to know treated the soil with love and care. There was a relationship of caring, not a relationship of extraction that dominates capitalism and large-scale agriculture. The soil and the land were relatives, no matter where they lived. Gorkam, a Kurd from Turkey, was bringing soil from all parts of the four corners of Kurdistan to her farm. And as one of the senses, the soil for Gorkam was an important place of memory. Many Kurdish Americans took part in the practices of keeping the soil healthy, composting especially to enliven the soil. This included setting up relationships with not only the soil, but the organization or organisms on the soil. For example, I noticed many families placing directly the organic waste onto the garden plots. Instead of into a composter, they put it straight into the garden. This organic waste, such as bits of tomatoes, carrots, and leafy vegetables, fed the insects, birds, chipmunks, and rabbits while enriching the soil naturally. Kosh Miskin, who came post-1996, split her section into one just for veggies and a side just for flowers. She, like many other Kurdish Americans, chose to alternate where certain plants are grown each year to facilitate diverse, rich root connections under the soil. This allowed for a greater movement of microbes, minerals, and energy through a varied root system. For example, the mycorrhizal fungi is a type of fungus that forms a relationship of symbiosis with roots. These healthy fungi are transferred across roots and are integral to plant life. The interconnected network of roots and fungi transfer health and nutrients across roots within and between gardens. The natural, environmentally safe methods of soil preservation facilitate fungi survival. Taking care of the soil was a practice of good kinship. Kurdish Americans showed that they were attentive relatives to the soil and all living organisms on this land. Kak Kamal watched YouTube videos as one way to make sure he could make the best natural fertilizer. Kak Rabin said, quote, "I mix the dirt every year," end quote, and does research to see which organic materials would best suit the soil. He put together the same variety of plants together and keeps the same species together as he believes it is his pattern of better health for the plant. With such pride in his voice, he said while stroking the leaves of the plant, quote, "I take care of my plants," end quote. In addition to nurturing the soil, the very living patterns in Nashville created interesting botanical connections. Kurdish American homes were often very near to each other. In some cases, families lived right next door to each other. Accordingly, the roots went from garden to garden, house to house, thereby creating this incredible exchange of energy across houses. It redefines how we think about neighborhood, property, and individuality. Not only were Kurdish Americans in contact with each other, but the roots of their plants were in contact with each other. And scholar Kar Modi states, quote, "Scientists acknowledge that trees talk to one another too, while caring and sharing resources in symbiotic relationship with other species like mycelium for STEM folks here. I know I butchered it. As a community, trees honor and rely upon their elders, for the oldest and tallest trees are hubs or matriarchs of nutrients. Power is not really good at all unless you share it, end quote. There was an intricate connection of roots underground across gardens that conveyed histories of sharing and caring between humans and non-humans. So as we think about this, moving from the soil, I want to talk about plants and sowing seeds. And I want to open with a poem by the incredible poet Ada Limon, who came to speak on our campus. Have you ever noticed how the trees change from state to state? Not all at once, of course, more like a weaver, gradually weaving in another color until the old trees become scarce and new trees offer a shaded kingdom, all of their own. Before I knew the names of towns or roads, I could recognize places by trees. As Ada Limon mentions in her poem, trees prove important in making places feel familiar and related. Trees are one way to recognize places. For Kurds in the US diaspora, plants from Kurdistan were not present locally. Without these plants, the landscape was not recognizable as a Kurdish place. However, through sowing and planting of plants and trees in the soil they had cultivated, the land is reconfigured into a recognizable Kurdish place. The plants have histories that illuminate the ways people, plants, animals, and histories travel together. In some Kurdish American homes, vegetables, flowers, herbs, fig trees, and pomegranate trees originated from seeds that they or their relatives brought from Kurdistan. As diaspora is often understood through the metaphor of the scattering of seeds, the stories of the dispersal of seeds in Kurdish America make it an apt metaphor for describing Kurdish placemaking. Take, for example, the vineyard owner, Sid Torin. He brought back seeds from the very mulberry trees that his great-great-grandfather planted in their village in Kurdistan, and that's now in his vineyard. Adam Centenaire, the owner of a Kurdish farm in New Jersey, when showing me his beautiful farm, brought me to the apple orchard. There were apples he had gotten from Kurdistan. Unlike the perfectly shaped apples I had eaten at apple orchards in New York State and seen in grocery stores across the U.S., Centenaire's apples were bumpy and lumpy. He plucked one off the tree, handed it to me, and asked me to eat it. I looked at it. It did not look appetizing. But here I am as a guest in his farm. I hesitantly took a bite, and it was the juiciest, sweetest apple I had ever eaten. Along with this farm, Kurds across Nashville tried to create these transnational forms of intergenerational kinship and placemaking through seed movement. The roots stretch and connect across oceans, if not always connected underground. DR, a post-1977 Kurd, walked me around his garden and shared how most of his plants came from seeds that originated in Bashur, Iraqi Kurdistan. He was proud of how year after year he would save the seeds to replant. This was a multi-generational investment in Kurdishness through extending the life of plant families across generations. While children and elders have been lost and died through the treacherous refugee journeys and state violence, the seeds get to plant roots in Nashville. Again, for Kamal, an elder, he got the seeds for the celery, Swiss chard, tomatoes, and cucumbers from Kurdistan. If he did not bring it back on his trips, he and his wife, Kosh Jian, would ask people traveling back from Kurdistan to bring their desired seeds. When Kumar's wife goes to Rojalat, she gets seeds for most of the plants they grow in their garden. Kosh Mishkin, who came post-1996, gets her celery seeds from Kurdistan, but everything else from Home Depot and Lowe's. Shanar and her father, Kak Amajgar, each first planted seeds in their garden from Kurdistan. The first seeds from Kurdistan then play a vital role, and this is the picture of their garden, played a vital role in creating root networks that extended across seasons, whereby creating relationships with the soil. The planting of seeds and the harvesting brought Kak Mohammed and sense of saber, a Badani word, Kurdish dialect, for joy and a sense of connectivity. The gardens offer not only a moment to connect with nature, but various moments to connect with other Kurdish Americans. As Kak Mustafa and Kosh Sara arrived recently to Nashville only in 2020, they got stems and seeds from other Kurdish people in Nashville. Kek Haman, who came post 1986, exchanged seeds with other Kurds, especially okra, radish, and Swiss chard. The sharing of seeds within the Kurdish community created patterns of kinship, both botanical and human, between Kurds and Nashville. If one person had a successful plant, the seeds of the plant were shared with other Kurdish friends and family. But there's something really, really interesting here, which is that everybody wanted to grow fig trees, pomegranate trees, and grape vines. And none of those worked in Nashville because of the climate, the temperature, and the soil. But every single garden had it, and this was the only garden out of the 20 that had really successful grapevines that actually produced fruit. None of the others produced fruit. So nearly every Kurdish American garden had fig trees, but these trees struggled mightily in Nashville. Why would Kurdish Americans grow something that failed nearly every season? Why put so much time and labor to grow fig trees that did not yield much, if any, fruit? Kurdish Americans remembered fondly the fig trees as one of the vivid reminders of Kurdistan, along with pomegranate trees, apple trees, and grapevines. I also barely saw any pomegranates in Kurdish gardens grow into full trees. And as an Indian growing up in India with delicious pomegranate trees, all I saw was failing small bushes. Although Kurdish Americans hoped for successful and bountiful harvest, just the presence of these trees, like Ada Limon's poem, was a pleasurable reminder of home. It was a moment of insistence. Similarly, many Kurdish American families grew grapes. Although most were unsuccessful, they did use the leaves to make dolma, a very traditional Middle Eastern dish. And Kurdish American families drove to nearby Kentucky also to purchase seeds, fruit, vegetables, and other items from the Amish community. Why the Amish? Nashville's Iraqi and Iranian Kurds had beautiful relationships with the Amish. They all had lovely stories to share about the long trips from Nashville to Kentucky. And when Kurdish Americans were not getting seeds from each other, they were getting seeds from the Amish. Kurdish American families confessed to me that the seeds from the Amish were of better quality, was more organic, and was less expensive than the seeds at Home Depot and Lowe's. Kumar, a Rojalat Kurd, said, quote unquote, their farm is special, meaning the Amish. This specialness consisted of the organic and non-capitalistic nature of Amish farming. Amish farming, de-linked from capitalism, extraction, and profit making, aligned with the joys of Kurdish American gardening. Thus, the seeds from the Amish were highly sought out. And so what happened to the plants? Gardening and eating the food in shared spaces sustained a Kurdish American community. Quote, neuroanthropologist John Allen has argued that the taste, smell, and texture of food can be extraordinarily evocative, bringing back memories not just of eating food itself, but also of place and setting, end quote. Memories of food are memories of home, migration, and displacement. And all Kurds I talked to who were in the refugee camps, in Turkey especially, and in Iran, shared stories of food poisoning at the camps. With a history of food poisoning at refugee camps, Nashville's Kurdish Americans took gardening as a serious enterprise to grow their own food and nourish their families safely. Most Kurdish Americans in Nashville grew only plants that would end up on the table as food. These items include, but were not limited to, kori, which is a poisonous plant that they knew how to cultivate, and I tried, also known as arum, figs, Swiss chard, pomegranate, grapes, okra, pecans, almonds, pistachio, blackberries, mulberries, mint, celery, parsley, purslane, tomatoes, cucumbers, watermelons, varieties of pepper, varieties of beans, prickly pear, cabbage, lettuce, varieties of mushroom, peach, apple, plum, pear, kale, dill, oregano, arugula, turnips, radishes, basil, peppermint, olives, grapes, thyme, potatoes, Jerusalem artichoke, garlic, chives, beets, rhubarb, Brussels sprouts, zucchini, cilantro, leeks, walnut, raspberry, eggplant, persimmon, peach, cherry, apricot, Asian pear, and nettle. They planted everything to create a vibrant food source that was home. Coach Gian expressed such profound joy waking up every morning to pull aside the curtains to see the vegetables growing in the yard and pluck them to be cooked that day. Chard, cabbage, eggplant, onions, Roma tomatoes, and grape leaves were used for dolma. Celery was used in nearly every Kurdish dish. Coach Gian made homemade yogurt. She explained to me that she would boil the milk first. She would add 2 spoons of yogurt to the warm milk and then cover with a blanket for 3 to 4 hours. She used whole milk. Kurdish American women often played the key role in making their own yogurt, to which she plucked herbs and vegetables from the garden to add to it. Mutlu Sirakova explains, quote, "From a multi-species perspective, fermentation is a process where microbes, animals, and plants meet and thrive. Where biodiversity becomes more than a gathering of species, it is a web of relations and interactions that hold its own stories," end quote. In addition to making yogurt, Kurdish Americans converted figs and mulberries into jam. They made so many healthy ways to eat rice, make soups, and various types of dolma. Quote, "Recipes are handed down like genetics," end quote. While the U.S. government does not actively ask residents to grow their own food for health, Kurds are doing it as a health choice and as a mechanism of physical and cultural survival. There are not healthy food options for poor, working class, refugee, and lower middle class families in U.S. grocery stores. It is expensive to eat healthy. Kurdish Americans I got to know harvested food from their gardens and controlled their access to good health. Lots of vegetables at breakfast and dinner, along with leafy items instead of starch, were key to healthy diets in Kurdish American homes. They were not only healthy, but importantly, they were delicious, were part of the regular Kurdish food culture, and brought them pleasure. And many Kurdish American families used sumac in their dishes, even though it was impossible to grow it in Nashville's wet, humid weather. They got it from the Kurdish grocery stores on the main road in Nashville. The gardens, while bringing back memories and histories of Kurdistan, had profound medical components as well. Ethnobotanical practices. Managed life in a new ecology with its own particular germs and symptoms of sickness. Nashville's Kurds used a variety of herbs, garlic, sumac, and other plants to manage a variety of ailments, especially diabetes, with a high sugar content in U.S. food. So this is where plants become part of the kinship, part of the Kurdish family. But so were animals. So animals and non-human, animal and human kinship was very prevalent in Kurdish gardens as well. Several of the Kurds I met, along with Sid Torum and Adam Centenaire, who you see in the picture, nurture beautiful, intimate, and deep connections to the animals on their land. Many of the Iraqi and Iranian Kurds in Nashville shared that most of their family histories as horticulturists. Torin's beautiful horse is named Dildil, which in Kurmanchi means heart. And Shanila Koja Mulji, a gender studies scholar, explains, quote, "Indeed, indigenous feminists have long emphasized their spiritual, cultural, economic, and political relationship with the land, blurring the boundaries between bodies and environments. Such relationships are not only ceremonialized, but also appear in the ways in which native languages assign animate status to that which in Western discourses may appear as inanimate, end quote. His two peacocks have Kurdish names. One is named Sisse and the other is Tahus. Tahus references a messenger or angel to heaven. With the prominence of peacocks in Yazidi faith as well as in Zoroastrianism, the peacocks connected Kurdish religious and cultural history prior to the arrival of Islam. Sid Torin's mule is named Tadal, which in Kurmanji means handsome. His donkey is named Oske, which is a Kurmanji word for gypsy, which is simultaneously a part of longer histories of racism and the racialization of the Roma, but also an allusion to the displacements and continued movement of Kurdish people. There is a co-constituted intimacy, communication, and forms of kinship through his love for animals. As I sat on the kubota, the animals joyfully walked over to Torin. Torin's smile really stressed the interconnectedness between all species. He asked me to step out of the kubota. I stepped out. The moment I stepped out and my foot hit the ground, the horse and mule dispersed. They made sounds announcing their discomfort with me and backed away. I was not family. When I got back on the kubota, the animals once again stepped closer to Torin and established this sense of familial comfort. And this picture at Adam Centenaire's farm in 2021, I could see the animal pen to the right side of the farm. There were goats, sheep, and cows, along with a wide assortment of chickens. After I met Adam in his office, he took me outside, and two enormous Anatolian shepherds came out and approached him and me with such reverence and love. Centenaire said sternly, "Stan, those are not Anatolian shepherds. Those are Kangol." And I said, "What's Kangol?" "Those are Kurdish shepherds. The white one was named Newroz, which is the Kurdish New Year, the most important time in the Kurdish season. And the other one, the brown one, was named Scooby, after Scooby-Doo." And it is fascinating here to see how Kurdish sensibilities and US popular culture intersected with the naming of his non-human kin. Adam posted proudly on Facebook all the births of his sheep, goats, and puppies at his farm. Their birth brought such joy. He took joy in showcasing the baby goats with his very young children. Why baby goats and his children? Because it was mutual connections, mutual love, and mutual care in this family. And the death of animals also brought great sorrow and grief. Torin mentioned with great sadness in his heart the nearly 40 goats and sheep that were killed during the horrendous California wildfires in 2020. But while managing loss, Torin and Centenaire find ways to connect with living non-human kin and have other people share that experience of kinship. Sid Torin established a petting zoo on the vineyard so that all ages could experience the intimate connections with animals. In his petting zoo area, he had a large coop for birds, particularly chickens, roosters, and the peacocks. Torin named the coop Fakir Tehran. When I asked him about the choice of name, Torin said with glee that he named it after the famous Kurdish poet Fakir Tehran. Tehran is a Kurdish poet who lived in the 1600s and was a key figure in Kurdish Sufi literature, who loved and wrote so many poems about birds. And Kak Ribban, an elder who came post-1986 to Nashville, loved his parakeets and his shukar partridge. Immense pride mingled with joy. Kak Ribban took me over to a very large wired coop. In it, he showed me the Kurdish national bird, the caw, which is also called the shukar partridge, that he purchased in Kentucky on an Amish farm. While far removed from the mountains of Kurdistan, the presence of the Ka interjects a Kurdishness upon the U.S. zoological landscape. He emphasized again and again that my book had to include the picture of the Ka because it would be recognizable and enjoyable for all Kurds. They would immediately recognize it as the national bird. So with that, I want to conclude. Gardens proved vital to preserving meaningful Kurdish practices, foregrounding diverse forms of kinship, and ensuring connections to the land, regardless of the nation they resided in. The land in the host nation was reconfigured into a joyful place with connections to the soil and a place of various types of kinship with each other, with plants, and with animals. With the great delight in farms, gardens, vineyards, to table pathways, the homing practices through gardens were never complete. Gardens made it feel like home, but it could never resemble the ancestral home. When I inquired what else Kurdish Americans in Nashville would like to grow, Shanar and her father would love to grow apples, apricots, pomegranate, and peach if the climate was better. Kumar stated, quote, "If I have an apple garden, I would feel like I am home," end quote. Gardening for Kumar, quote, "is an enjoyable time and you can exercise," end quote. When I asked about home and garden, he stated clearly, quote, "There is no way we can be home. I am missing a lot of things. Voluntarily or involuntarily, I belong here," end quote. The U.S. feels like home to him now and a place where one can recreate memories without the trap of national belonging. It is a practice of insistence. The garden, quote, "reminds me of a lot of things from back home, all the memories from my childhood," end quote. Kak Haman, who came post-1986, could not stop smiling about every part of his gardening experience. He could not wait to get out into the garden. He said, quote, "I am so happy. When I wake up, I pray, and I wait for a chance after I finish. I have to go work. I love working in the garden. I feel so comfortable," end quote. Thus, I had assumed the garden was home for him. He shook his head with a heavy heart and said, quote, "I am still tied and living with the memories back in my country," end quote. The garden in Nashville offered him a way to experience home, but Nashville still does not feel like home. Cultivating gardens can be a sanctuary and a way to dream about home, but it is not home. In fact, Kak Hamin mentioned that he dreams about and thinks about Dohok, his home in Kurdistan, often. The gardens offer a template on how to create sustainable, interconnected forms of living that are not dependent on the nation state. Gardens are in the margin of private life, but in the center of meaningful Kurdish lives. That's it. Yeah, I'll take questions. I would love any comments, any questions. This is the second chapter of my book project. The first chapter looks at the early Kurds in Butte, Montana during the copper rush and what it meant to manage life in a mostly Irish-dominated Catholic town that required exploitable foreign labor, right? Yeah.
What was on that land before their farm?
Oh, which one? The
one
in New Jersey?
Oh, I don't know. Which either.
Okay, so great. So Sid Torrin for the vineyard.
Okay.
What he got was he was a very prominent businessman in Istanbul. He was so prominent that Senior Bush and Barbara Bush came to his restaurant for a meal. All the big political actors in the globe who came to Istanbul came to his restaurant. He decided to run for mayor. And that's when the idea of a Kurd as mayor brought about so much anti-Kurdish resentment that police and secret services came to his house at random times. And he was so afraid of losing his life and everything with it that he and his wife fled to Atlanta. And so he came as as a refugee. And in Atlanta, he started working poor with Home Depot. He did so well that Home Depot wanted him to go and work at a center they had established in California. As he was working there, he was driving around the area, and there was this one area that was not developed at all, that was just a wooded area that said place for sale, owned by a CIA officer. And the US has incredibly intimate ties with Kurds. The ways in which the US has worked with Kurds to throw out Saddam Hussein, worked with Kurds to stop ISIS, and so on. The US celebrates its ties to Kurdish communities, that there are many more opportunities. So this person had links and knew of Kurds. So it was like, oh, you're Kurdish? Here, I'm going to sell you the land for only this much, and I want you to create your vineyard. So what he did was, this is where we have to think about insistence rather than resistance, because he actually had to tear the land apart, right? So there are parts of environmental justice that do not take shape here, right? So he actually removed the entire, so he bought a 400-acre lot. He used 40 for the vineyard, which had to be completely gutted. So, and he planted olive trees as an environmentally safe project because of their abilities to set much deeper roots on the ground and have a longer lifespan than oak trees. So everything prior to that were oak trees in that area. Yeah. Yeah.
Where they have to come back and replant, even though it dies. I believe there's a sense of self-preservation.
Yeah.
And that's the key that I see in this, right?
Yeah.
The symbolism of, I'm not home, but this represents a
Yeah.
form of life.
Yes.
And I think that's where they get the energy to keep coming back.
Yes.
I
Yes.
don't want to let go.
Yes.
I want some piece of my
Yes.
country, even though it's not the real thing, but this garden represents something bigger than just a garden. When they share seeds with each other,
Yeah.
it's spreading our DNA once again.
Yes.
And we're spreading our culture in different places where we are. So very powerful
Yeah.
symbolism
Yeah.
in what you have presented.
I love the way you phrased that, Gabe, because that is it, right? That even in death, they're talking about life. That even though we might not have had ancestors that could travel and make the treacherous refugee journeys, our seeds are able to have this intergenerational life, right? So it's not refusing the state violence, but it's saying amidst the state violence, we have our own ways of creating and sustaining life. And that life doesn't have to be just the human, right? That Kurdish culture is sustained through non-human life, both plant and animal. Yeah, 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 yeah.
You know, Stan, we should have kept an hour just for the question and answers. Those were so
Oh no,
great.
great questions and
But
comments,
on
yeah.
behalf of everyone, thank
Yeah.
you so
Oh,
very
thank
much.
you, everyone. Thank you, thank you.
Next year, when the
Well,
book is published, we shall repeat this with lots more time for questions.
yeah,
Yep.
thank you.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Dr. Stan Thangaraj. I'm the James E. Hayden Chair for the Study of Race, Ethnicity, and Social Justice at Stonehill College. I'm a cultural anthropologist that studies immigrants and refugees in the U.S. South. And what I presented today on is part of my larger book project on Kurdish communities in the U.S., with a focus on Kurds in Nashville and the northeastern states of New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. My project is really invested in and interested in thinking about how Kurds who do not have a nation of their own try to make a sense of a Kurdish place. How do you make a Kurdish place when it's not possible within the national landscape? That it can't be the same as a national place. And so this is just one chapter, chapter 2 of the book project on looking at how Kurdish placemaking happens across the US. And the first chapter is about Kurds and Butte, Montana during the copper rush. The second project, the one on gardens. The third project is about the importance of Kurdish language and how they make it have a life in the diaspora. The fourth one is about Kurdish artists and to think about what does Kurdish art do to give us a sense of longer Kurdish histories and pleasures, and also what Kurds tell us about themselves. And the final one is on Kurdish dance and Kurdish soccer, to think about how does the body become a way to think about and make Kurdish places. Thank you.